Okay, here we are with Pierre Bouvard, who is the Chief Insights Officer for Cumulus Media and Westwood One, somebody I've known for a long time. Pierre, thank you for joining us as we kick off our maiden journey into a new format for the influencer audience. This is our first time doing this type of interview, so thank you for being brave and delving into what can be a very contentious topic with us today.
My pleasure.
And so, a little context on your bunker.
Yes.
Where are we this morning?
So we are in Westchester County, New York. We are in the best, quietest place in the house. This is my wife's beautiful closet.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully the sound quality is good. The dog's not going to barge in. The teenagers don't know where I am. So hopefully the sound quality will be sufficient.
All right. And are you going to get in trouble when she sees that you put this stuff on display for thousands of people? That's yeah. There you go. All right. Well, that by the way, this is not real. This is the Churchill War Room behind me. So those are his sleeping quarters, but it's an upgrade from what I'm really doing. So anyway, glad you're here. Let's get down to business.
Sure.
You are easily one of the most, if not the most prolific researchers and purveyors of market data in the audio field, having been called the Anthony Fauci of audio by some. And so the reason I wanted to have a conversation with you that I thought would be really helpful for our readers and our audience is there's a lot of skepticism right now because so many reports are coming out, particularly around radio, saying, hey, you know what? Radio's holding its audience. It's fine. Everything's fine. We're maintaining 90+% of our ratings, and yet, we look into the marketplace. We know things are different. We know we're not on the road. We know that radio, in particular, is an out of home medium more often than it is in the traditional sense.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that fuel consumption is down about 50% right now in this country. So I think advertisers are really struggling to figure out what data is reliable and, what's the real story? What's actually happening here? So
Sure.
do you mind just starting with kind of the big picture as you see it?
Sure. So in audio, like in TV, the coin of the realm is Nielsen. And Nielsen has 80,000 Americans wearing a little tiny gizmo that looks like an old cell phone. It's very tiny. It clips onto the purse or the belt, and it hears what they hear. So it's passive, it's portable. They wear this thing 15 hours a day. It hears all the TV they watch. It hears all the radio. So this is not a survey like asking people, do you remember what you did yesterday? This is something that is electronic. It's minute by minute. So it is pretty darn accurate in terms of what's really happening now. Yesterday, which was the 15th or the 14th, Nielsen released a pretty big analysis of their measurement month of March. And March is a 50-50 month, meaning half was normal, half was COVID. So we know that it's a blend. But what they said is radio retained about 96% of the reach. Reach is just the fancy media word for different people. And on average, it retained about 90% of the average quarter-hour audience. And the average quarter-hour audience, if you just think about it at its most simplest, it's the audience for one commercial. If you just ran one commercial, that's how many people you'd hit. So you do the math and you say, well, that's the blended number. So maybe the back half was maybe down 20. All of this is much less erosion than what people think. And one of the interesting things about our media and marketing business is there's a massive difference between perception and reality. People, agencies, and advertisers have told me, oh, listening is a quarter of normal levels, or it's a third of normal levels. So this says, if you just do the back of the envelope math, we're at 80% of normal levels. And in network radio, like in network TV, audiences are guaranteed. So bonus weight is run to get to those impressions. So It is not nearly as horrific as many expected. And in fact, Nielsen's, their headline was that, radio is beating expectations. The other thing that's fascinating about their report yesterday was they isolated the last week of the survey, March, and they looked at what percent of American radio listening was occurring away from home versus in home. And in the month of March, 62% and this is, the last week of March, 62% of all American radio listening was away from home. And so a lot of us in the agency world are like, well, I'm at home. Everybody must be at home. Well, no. Hill Holliday, an agency out of Boston, has done a study that asked workers, American workers, like, are you home or are you? Only about 44% of American workers are sheltering at home. So there's still people working at Dunkin', at the Business Essential, on Wall Street. There's still lots of Americans, about half or even 60% of Americans, they're still going to work. So I thought that was the one interesting number, is that, there's still a majority of out-of-home listening going on. Canada uses the portable meter, and they're seeing the same thing. There's still more people listening away in terms of time spent than at home.
So I think AQH is an important metric that you brought
Mm-hmm.
up earlier, average quarter hour, right? And when I was working on the radio side, that was always the number I looked at, because I felt like, if you took a picture of the market frozen in time, that's how
Mm-hmm.
many people you could count that were listening at that moment,
Yep.
right? Like you
Yep.
said, when the commercial runs. It seems to me that there's still not a lot of clarity on what's happening to that number throughout the different day parts. And so, for example, I saw in the report that just came out that middays seem to be holding strong. Well, that might make sense to me because that's not drive time. Cars are off the road. Typically, those are a lot of people that actually have a radio in their house and turn it on, things like that. So that would make sense that habits stay the same in that environment. What is happening to the morning drive audience by percentage?
Sure.
On
So,
an AQH basis?
Yep. So if you look at Nielsen's report from yesterday, they say that in the morning, radio retained about 87% of its normal audience. In the midday, it was 92%. So there's definitely more retention occurring midday versus the morning. The meter, the cool thing about the meter is says when it gets picked up. And what Nielsen is finding is that people are waking up later. When you don't have to go to work, you sleep a little later.
Yeah.
In TV, TV is telling us they have a day part in TV called early news, 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. is down 19% in TV. I think that's all of the same thing. It's like,
Yeah.
later.
Let me put it a different way, and I think that's helpful, and I think that makes sense, and certainly my experience agrees with that. That everybody's starting later, ending later,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. But if you were to take a picture of from a satellite of America right now, while it's 9:04 in the morning, how many cars do you think are on the road today at this moment versus what would have happened if we did this 90 days ago? What's your actual theory on that?
So there is a company in out of home called Geopath, and Geopath is like the Nielsen of the outdoor industry.
Yeah.
And on their website, they have a tracker that actually shows that they're harvesting data from cell phones and stuff like that, and they show year over year. So there is less traffic on the road. So no question, there's less traffic, and that's causing less time spent. However, one of the other headlines that Nielsen reported yesterday is at-home listening is up 29%.
So just to clarify, when you're talking about the midday holding at 92%, you're
Yes.
talking about drive time 87%. Are you combining the streaming listenership with the terrestrial feeds?
So Nielsen, all of those numbers in Nielsen reports is everything. So that's all locations and all
Mhm.
manner of listening. So what they
Gotcha. Okay, so if we're just talking real, we wouldn't claim those same percentages. We're aggregating when we do that math.
I just lost your last comment.
Oh, shoot. Okay. I'm clarifying. So I'm saying back to you, it appears that when you're talking about the 87%, the 92%,
Mhm.
that's got streaming baked into it. So, for example, terrestrial could be down 50%, but if streaming is now accounting for an extra 30%, that's how you start to make up that ground, is basically
Yeah,
what you're saying.
but I
Okay, so
would
it's
be
shifting.
yeah, be careful with your streaming numbers. So Nielsen, which encodes the streams, will tell
Hmm.
you in a normal time, 6% of all American radio listening is streaming. Six.
Yep.
So we're talking little slices here.
Yeah.
Um, so, and the other thing that they've said is that when they look at the streaming numbers over the last month or two, a couple of months, they're stable.
Hmm.
Triton, which is another digital audio measurement company, they say they just came out last week and they said streaming for AM FM radio stations is up about 3. So it looks like streaming is very stable, but it's super small. So it's not a big percent of total radio listening. Afternoon drive, just to keep going through the day, was it retained about 88% of listening. And then nights and weekends were about 91%. So, if you think about what does the weekend look like? The weekend looks like an upside down U. You're not going to work. So
Yeah.
every hour listening grows and grows and grows. And then it's
Yeah.
very strong midday. So what's sort of happening is that we're sort of halfway between a weekend day and a weekday. There's still people that are working and they're working at home. And the fact that the streaming numbers are stable suggests that people that used to be at work and were playing radio stations have now literally shifted that behavior to the home. They're still working, they just happen to be in a different place. And Nielsen also reported that time spent to streaming at home is going up.
Yeah. So, Pierre, I don't know how much you can talk about this, but we know that revenue is getting hit uh, almost without exception for different media organizations. But my perception is that local radio is getting hit much harder than podcast, than streaming, than the national networks. Is that something that is okay for you to validate, or can you
Well, I don't I
talk
don't
about that?
have I don't have hard data yet,
Yeah.
but if you think about it, what is the engine of local radio? It's local retail,
Yeah.
bars, restaurants,
Yeah.
chiropractors, a lot of those businesses are actually closed. So it makes sense to say that any local media, local out of home, local TV that really rely, car dealers, those businesses are closed. Where on the national level, you have insurance companies, you have pharma, direct to consumer, which is a big engine for podcasting, has always been a business without retail stores. So
Yeah.
I think that generalization makes sense, that national platforms are probably better off than local platforms that are more like local retail direct.
But that's more a function of accessibility
Yes.
than
Or
it
even
is
that the
about
stores are
consumption,
open. Yeah.
is your thesis there. Okay, that's helpful. Let's talk about that you've got half the traffic during the day that you normally have, and um, then you've got rock formats or music formats holding their audiences. On the other hand, I can imagine that if you provide local news, if you provide local coverage, and you're talking about issues that aren't going to get covered by Pandora or Spotify or any national streaming outlet, you really have an advantage. Can you talk about how much formats are up or down
Sure.
by AQH, generally speaking?
Yeah, Nielsen released this yesterday, and I think the headline is it's surprisingly consistent. So they tracked format share February to March, and the number one story is that if you look format by format, how consistent those shares are. Yes, news talk, all news is up, not surprisingly,
So,
but
so give me some examples. So let's pretend that if a station and for the audience, the is a total number of people that tune in a week. Let's say you have a
Mhm.
station that's got a million cume, and let's say that the prime time, the 6 a to 7 p.m. average quarter hour, you've always got about 100,000 people listening. So if you got 100,000 and you're talking about a news format, what is that now if it was 100,000 on average? How much is that up to?
And I'm going to generalize,
Yeah,
but
of course, of
I would
course.
say that probably the news stations, their average quarter hour audience is flat. And so if total listening, the denominator is down maybe 10%, that means
Yeah,
their share has popped up.
got it.
But when you go through the Nielsen deck in the study, it is remarkable how consistent the formats are. And part of this is because I think we're already at the point where there's coronavirus fatigue. Chartbeat, which is a company that analyzes online content, shows a plateauing and a beginning of a drop in interest in coronavirus searches, reading articles, stuff like that. So, when you ask radio listeners, why do you listen to your, favorite radio station? And here's what they say. They say, funny and entertaining DJs, music that I like, picks me up and makes me feel good. Like, these are the motivators of radio. Yes, information about my market and news and is in there. And also connection to the community. I want to know what's going on in my town. And this is where the Pandoras and Spotifys are basically a box of music. They're literally just a bunch of songs. They're not really connecting you to the community. So I think that's why we're not seeing as much shifts, in these format shares, is that these stations have upped information about coronavirus. They are talking about, there's a senior hour at the Kroger. But, when we just did a study of listeners and asked them, how much of normal programming do you want versus coronavirus? That it was 80-20. Most people decidedly come down and say, just give me the classic rock that you guys normally do. And so I think it's not like people want all news all the time.
Gotcha. It's the OJ factor is kicking in. People have just had enough for a while. Okay, so we'll go rapid fire on the next few things because I know I got to get you out of here. But what format is the biggest beneficiary, and what format is the hardest hit? Who are the outliers?
No question. Spoken word, news talk are seeing share growth. That's not surprising. If you looked at Nielsen's data, I think you'd see top 40 or contemporary hit radio probably has lost a little bit, but these are not dramatic swings. I mean, when you look at these shares, you're like, oh, that's half a point, Pierre. That's not that much. But, if you had to say who saw some erosion, it seems to be kind of top 40.
And what about sports?
Sports was remarkably in there. It held. And it's like, well, there's nothing to talk about. But the point is, what draws people to these stations are the personalities and the talent. And they're talking about other stuff. They're talking about, like, just today we heard the PGA has put their first event on the calendar for June, but sports ratings are hanging in there, which is surprising given the lack of sports.
And I suspect over the course of the week, a lot of different thoughts and reports are going to come out breaking down the Nielsen data. As we're looking at that and seeing all that information, would it be a safe rule of thumb to say, take whatever change numbers you're seeing and double them? Because we know that that's measuring March, and the shelter at home enforcement really kicked in mid-March.
Well, it depends what your time horizon is. So if you want to place advertising money right now in April, like literally this month, possibly that would be a good approach. But if you're talking about May or June, and I don't want to be
we don't want to speculate
forecasting, I think one of the cool things, and I've urged Nielsen to do this, is that because they have these 80,000 people, and they know if the person is in home or out of home, because there's a little transmitter in the house that is a beacon that's picked up by the device that says you're home. The minute you walk out of your house, the PPM can't hear the beacon and it clocks you as out of home. That data And I'm urging Nielsen to kind of publish that every week, because that's going to show us the return. Because when we start to see the percent of listening out of home going up and up and up, it means stores are reopening, people are reemerging. So I think that's going to be an important number to track.
Okay, so let's shift a little bit, because most of what people really want to talk about is podcasts, and I know I've been pressing you on radio the whole time. I know there are over 1 million podcasts available to people now, right? So like, how do you even generalize? But within the 0.1% that drive the market, of those that exist, how are different types of podcasts either succeeding or getting hurt in this environment? Are you finding that the ones that provide distraction and everything but COVID-19 are doing better or worse? What is that looking like?
Yeah, it's hard to generalize, but it is interesting. There's an interesting insight that came out yesterday from Edison that said the top 5 podcast networks reach 50% of the weekly audience.
Right.
And that's the first time I saw, because people talk, oh my God, 1 million podcasts. I could never buy that. I'm just going to not do podcasting. It's like, well, no. There are, just like on TV, the top 100 shows reach a lot of people. On our network, some of our spoken word, the Ben Shapiro's and this and that, they're seeing a tremendous amount of traction because there's news, there's a lot of things to discuss.
How much are they up by percentage?
I didn't, coming into this, I don't have hard numbers. I just heard we're up,
Yep.
But the other thing is, remember, there's distraction. And if you've just watched like 2 hours of Fox News or CNN and you are like COVIDed out, whether it's sports, whether it's, you name the topic, I'm sure you're seeing this too. There's still strong tuning to the things that I'm passionate about. And the thing about podcasting is it's 2 things. It's entertain me, but also I want to learn. And that hasn't gone away. Like, people still want to be entertained and they still want to learn something. And I think that's what makes people so attentive to podcasts, is because they're literally wanting to learn something, and you pay tremendous attention when you want to learn something.
And I guess to underscore your point about not everybody needing only news, we know news has been up, but about the importance of things that will only distract you and have no intrinsic value to the listener or viewer otherwise, for that to be a blockbuster in this environment just kind of shows America needs some distraction as well. So I buy that thinking. Do you think people are spending more or less today than they were 90 days ago?
So you sort of broke up. You said, is the question, do you think people are spending more, the same, or less time with podcasts?
Correct.
Okay. So in podcasting, there's no lack of audience measurement services. Everyone seems to come out with a new service. The one that I kind of look at directionally, because they seem to measure a lot of people, is PodTrack. And what they're showing is a modest decline, 5 to 10% maybe versus prior COVID. And I would chalk some of that up to the fact that, just like early morning news is down because people aren't commuting, and that radio listening is down a little bit in morning drive, I think that's impacting podcasts a little bit. But overall, a modest drop on top of year-to-date growth, I think, of 20%, means podcasting is still a place where you're going to reach a ton of people, and they're really paying attention to what you have to say.
Okay, and then we've touched on podcasts. We went deep into radio. What do you know about the smart speaker in this environment?
So what we know about the smart speaker is that people are spending more time with smart speakers. Triton, which is kind of the digital audio measurement gurus, they've been watching growth in smart speaker usage for audio streaming, and they also been watching growth in mobile. But the funny thing is, as you know this from the Edison data, podcasts are not listened a lot on smart speakers.
Yeah.
And it's a small thing. And I think because it's a personal thing, it's me, my podcast, my headphones, as opposed to, everyone here in the kitchen.
Hmm.
But the interesting thing is, a recent study asked people who have a smart speaker, like, do you know how to use a smart speaker to listen to the radio? And amazingly, a third of the people said, no, I don't. So I still think there's a lot more education that has to go into, like, you can actually listen to a podcast on a smart speaker, and also how to ask it to play the podcast. Because search and discovery for podcasts on a smart speaker is a little bit bumpy if you don't
Right.
have the exact right thing to ask it.
Right. Okay, so we've had you for a long time here. Before we go, just imagine that the person who is listening to this or watching it or reading the recap, they're a direct-to-consumer brand, they're a performance marketer, they still have the ability to advertise, but are very concerned about striking the wrong tone, jeopardizing their core business because they're spending money on advertising when people are
Mhm.
spending less money. What advice would you give to them?
So we have a lot of lessons that can be learned from prior recessions, good and bad lessons. Um, Brands that go dark, it could take them 5 years to regain market share. So there is a scary lesson that if you go dark, you are going to lose a tremendous amount of momentum, not in the short term, but in the long term. The other lesson from prior recessions is that continuing to advertise generally means you increase your share of voice. Share of voice is simply saying, if I'm in a certain category, how much spending is going on, and what is my spending divided by total spend. If the market or the category is spending less and you actually maintain spending, your share of voice goes up. And there's a lot of studies that show that if you overspend your market share, like your share of revenue, with your share of voice, your business grows. And one of the great lessons from 2008 was GM pulled back, Hyundai came in, and they took the GM Super Bowl sponsorship. And they will tell you that they probably gained 10 years of advantage because they were able to really stay marketing and stay advertising. So what I would ask marketers is, look, what's your share of voice? What's your share of market? And if you overspend that share of market, you're actually going to grow in the medium and the long term.
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you for sharing all these insights and thank you for
Thank you.
answering the hard questions. I hope we get to do this again sometime and maybe one day we'll do it in person. Who knows?
Exactly. Or you can come to my wife's closet.
Yes. Thank you. We'll all be on our way. And if you're watching this or listening to this, but not subscribing to the influencer, we put out an issue once a week where we try to give you this kind of information and insights. You can go to oxfordroad.com and subscribe there. Thanks everybody for your time today.